What if calling isn't about being ready, but about being willing? This is the deeply human ache beneath the loud, colorful, hilarious, and chaotic animation in Spider Man Into the Spider Verse. In the film, Miles Morales doesn't feel qualified, he doesn't feel chosen, he doesn't feel enough. But by the end, he makes the leap anyway. Today, faith and film get a seat at the same table as we step into a world of glitching dimensions, graffiti tagged skylines, and a new Spider Man who absolutely does not feel ready. And if you've ever quietly wondered, maybe I'm just not the kind of person God really uses, this story is already closer to home than it looks. Let's roll film, and maybe by the end, you'll be ready to take a leap of faith. Hey friends, this is Cinematic Scripture, where scripture and film talk to each other so Christians who love Jesus and story can see their own lives inside God's story and share it naturally. Let's dive into the Spider-Verse. Into the Spider-Verse is set in a vibrant, glitching New York where multiple dimensions begin to collide. A teenager caught between two identities is suddenly thrust into a calling that he never asked for. He meets versions of Spider-Man who carry wounds, losses, and stories of their own, and each one becomes a mirror for the journey that he is afraid to take. Here is the five-part story structure for Into the Spider-Verse. We have the world. Miles is torn between two lives, the student his family expects and the creative soul longing for more. He feels like a glitch long before he ever becomes one. Disruption. A radioactive spider bites him. His body glitches, his identity glitches, and the multiverse cracks open. But there's action. Miles partners with alternate spider heroes to stop Kingpin. He imitates, he stumbles, and he doubts, but he keeps moving forward. The opposition. There are external enemies, yes, like Kingpin and Scorpion and others, but even more, there is fear, grief, self-doubt, comparison, and the ache of not belonging. And when we arrive at the new world at the end of the story, Miles embraces the role, not as a copy of others, but as his own kind of Spider-Man. He takes the leap, and in doing so, he becomes Miles Morales. The film asks us, what if calling isn't about being ready, but being willing? And the moment that question lands, the story invites us to slow down and listen beneath the animation. Okay, so I think it's easy to treat Into the Spider-Verse like a stylish superhero movie. It's comic book spectacle with jokes and colors and glitching dimensions, and it is fun and a crazy adventure from start to finish. But if you watch attentively, the film stops being a superhero origin story and it starts becoming a confession. Miles is not just a kid with powers. He's actually someone who's afraid he'll never measure up. Growing up in church, that idea of never being enough was the quiet soundtrack under my spiritual life. See, as a pastor's kid, you soon realize that showing up, serving, and learning are never enough. So I get where Miles is coming from. But he's not alone in this story. There's other Spider-Man. There's Peter B. Parker, who isn't just a mentor, but he's a man who's forgotten how to hope. There's Gwen Stacy, who isn't just another spider hero. She's someone who lost a friend and built walls to survive. And the multiverse itself, it is built for revelation. Different styles, different wounds, different stories, all colliding at the moment Miles needs them most. Phil Lord, one of the creators behind the film, he said, anyone can wear the mask. That is the heartbeat of this story. So in this story, heroism isn't about uniqueness, it's about willingness. Identity isn't achieved, identity is received. The leap comes before the landing. Into the Spider-Verse shows us the fear of not being enough and the freedom of discovering you already are. And once that story has spoken, the characters step forward as mirrors for us, each one revealing something that we would rather keep hidden. Each spider person arrives with a wound, each carries their own story, and each has been shaped by loss, longing, and calling. And when the multiverse begins to merge, their desires, their fears, and flaws spill into the light. We have Miles Morales. His desire is to belong without losing himself. He's trying to walk this line of creative, but also who his parents want him to be. But his need is to trust the identity that is spoken over him. His fear is to not be enough, to not be smart enough, strong enough, to not even be Spider-Man enough. And the flaw that he has is the self-doubt that keeps him waiting for permission. He's the only one who doesn't glitch, but he feels like a glitch. And he is the only one who can save the multiverse in this film because it's in his universe. His arc at the beginning is he's trying to imitate others. And by the end, he becomes his own Spider-Man. Then there's Peter B. Parker. His desire is to avoid the pain of his past, but his need is restoration and renewed courage. Here's his fear. He has failed too deeply to be useful. That's what he's afraid of. And the flaw is his apathy disguised as humor. He needs to care again. And his arc from he starts the story beginning. In the beginning, he's detached, cynical, and resigned. And by the end, he is willing to try again. There's Gwen Stacy. She has this desire, connection without the risk of loss. She wants to be close to people without that risk. And her need is for a community that doesn't demand perfection, but a community that will just embrace her. Her fear is letting someone get close again because she's lost a friend. And that it becomes her flaw. It's isolation is self-protection. Her isolation hurts her. And her arc, in the beginning, she's closed, she's cautious. But at the end, she's choosing friendship over fear. There's Kingpin, okay? His desire is to undo his grief. He's trying to bring Vanessa and his son back. But his need is to surrender, to let go. And the fear he has is facing the pain that he has caused. He did this. And that leads to his flaw, which is control. He's forcing the world to obey his wounds and his rules. And that's the flaw that he carries. In the beginning, his arc, he's grasping for control, but in the end, it's his world collapsing under the weight. All of these wounds, these contradictions, these longings in this story, they converge in one moment. And it's when Miles is tied to his chair in his dorm, and his dad's at the door. The other Spider-Man have tied him to his chair and left him because he's becoming a liability because he can't control his powers. So Miles is overwhelmed. He's uncertain. He's been trying to imitate others, and he literally and emotionally is tied down right now. But there's an unbalance that's about to happen. His dad arrives at his dorm, and he knocks, and he knows that Miles is in there, but Miles can't respond. He's tied, he's gagged. And this distance feels unbridgeable. And here's what happens. In the scene, Miles, he's the protagonist because he's driving. He's the driver in this eternal paralysis, and his goal, he's wanting to belong, to be enough, to be seen. But he's got these obstacles of fear and silence and self-doubt, and that this belief that he is just not ready. And he hasn't wanted to face, he's been avoiding his dad all film. He's withdrawing from his family. He's hiding. He's shutting down because he's trying to figure things out. And he just has this feeling that he'll never be ready. And this is the emotional hinge of the film. And so what happens is his dad stands outside the door, and he talks to Miles, and he tells him how he loves him and how he's got this spark in him. And it's this moment where the father is actually blessing him without knowing that he's blessing Spider-Man. And Miles begins to receive this. The identity is spoken over him. And I love this. The identity is spoken before it's ever earned. And love arrives before Miles' readiness. So when his dad says, "I see a spark in you," he's telling Miles, "You don't have to prove anything to be mine. You are mine, and I love you, son." And so what happens in the scene is Miles breaks free. And it's not because he becomes powerful, but because for the first time he becomes known. So this scene, it names the ache beneath the entire film. We fear that we are not enough, even when the calling is already ours. Miles' internal glitch, if you will, is our glitch. That feeling of being out of sync with who we are and who we think we're supposed to be. The whole world is glitching around him, but it's also this imagery of what's going on inside of him. That internal paralysis that keeps him from moving is what keeps us from stepping into what God has already spoken over us. And the closed door between him and his dad is our closed door. That distance we feel between who we are and who we're called to be. And that blessing that he gets from his dad is the blessing that we long for, where its identity is spoken over us before we've ever earned it. In the language of Scripture, friends, that is called grace. God speaking the words "mine" over you before you've proven anything, and inviting you to walk with him as you are, not as you think you should be. He'll take care of that, but he invites you as you are. All right, so look, since Into the Spider-Verse is a film, we got to talk about how this story just communicates visually, all right? That is beautiful, beautifully animated film. Just the animation style, it is absolutely gorgeous. I could gush over it all day. I think it's awesome. But speaking of the animation, let's talk about it as this idea of identity. All right, every spider hero arrives in a different animation style, which I think is so cool. It's just this like visual sermon on difference. It's so interesting how it's done. The costumes can be seen as calling. Each suit is different. It's a confession of story, of wound, and the journey they've been on. There's the glitching that happens as this idea of dislocation. So again, I mentioned Miles himself doesn't glitch, but the world around him does. And I think that echoes the internal struggle that he's facing. But every single spider character besides him, they glitch, their bodies glitch, and it reveals this idea of they don't belong there. They're glitching out in the system. There's a moment where he takes one of the Peter Parker of his universe, his suits, and he repaints it. And it's this idea of graffiti as baptism, where he's painting his version of the suit over top of Spider-Man's suit. And it's this visual rebirth. Music plays a beautiful role in this film, where the soundtrack shifts as Miles grows. And it's this music, it represents his inner world, how it shifts and changes as he grows as a character. And then there's the leap, which is just this beautiful imagery of visual theology in a sense, because he just leaps off the building and trusts, and this falling becomes flying because he trusts the call. So the controlling idea of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is this: greatness doesn't come from pedigree, it's born in the leap of faith. Identity is received, it's not earned. Calling is chosen, it's not achieved. And failure, it forms you, it does not disqualify you. Community shapes what courage alone cannot. Spider-Verse is not interested in perfection. It is interested in the courage to begin. Will Miles take the leap? That is the theme of this film. Okay, so in Scripture, we're going to look at Exodus chapter 3 and chapter 4. It's this story where Moses is on the backside of the desert. He's shepherding. He's not in Egypt. He's run away. He killed an Egyptian, so he ran. And now he's been on the backside of the desert. And while he's tending his sheep, he goes up a mountain. And what does he see? He sees a bush that is burning, but is not burning up. It's just on fire. And he has a conversation with God there. And so in this, Moses stands before the burning bush. And he has every reason to say no. God is telling him to go back to Egypt. And as God tells him to go back to Egypt, Moses names his weaknesses. Well, I'm slow of speech. He names his fear. They won't believe me. He names his unreadiness. Please send someone else. See, here Moses believes a lie. If I'm not capable, then I cannot be called. But God answers him with presence, not with some kind of polish, but with presence. God says, I will be with you. I will help you speak. I will teach you what to say. See, friends, in this story, calling precedes confidence. Presence precedes performance. And identity precedes obedience. Moses doesn't step into calling because he feels ready. He steps into calling because God refuses to let unreadiness be the final word. And the gospel of Jesus Christ takes that truth further and brings it to its fullest clarity. We see this in Matthew 14, the story of Peter walking on water. Peter and the disciples are in the boat. They see a figure and they call, and it's Jesus. And Peter's like, if it's you, Lord, have me come out to you. And Jesus says, well, come on out in the water. It's in the middle of the storm. Peter, he steps out of the boat before he feels ready. He's walking on water, not because he's ready, because he's something special, but because he trusts the one who calls him. Jesus doesn't wait for competence or clarity or confidence or even stability for the waters to be chill. He calls Peter mid-fear, mid-storm, right in the middle of the story. And when Peter ultimately sinks because he takes his eyes off Jesus, Jesus doesn't shame him. Jesus reaches out and pulls him up. Because in the kingdom, failure is part of formation. Doubt is not disqualification. Sinking is not the end of the story. The leap matters more than the landing. Peter doesn't walk on water because he's exceptional. He walks because Jesus is present. And that's why the leap is more important than the landing, because when we leap, it is Jesus who catches us. See, the gospel, it speaks with this kind of clarity. It reframes everything we believe about calling, identity, and readiness. And for a lot of us, that is not abstract theology. It is the exact place where our spiritual exhaustion lives. We have been trying to become ready Christians in a world that keeps telling us to prove ourselves, while following a Jesus who keeps saying, just come to me and I will give you rest. And they're competing. The church tells us to prove ourselves, and Jesus says, come and rest. It leads to this exhaustion. But here's what the gospel says. The gospel says identity is spoken before obedience. That you don't have to earn to belong. Because the gospel says calling is extended before readiness. That you don't have to wait for confidence. And the gospel says grace meets you mid-story, that your weakness is not a barrier. The gospel says Jesus catches you when you sink, letting you know that the leap is safe. The gospel says difference is design. You don't have to become someone else to be used by God. Okay, so let's use our story lens. Is the theme of Into the Spider-Verse redemptive? Yes, very much so. Because Into the Spider-Verse insists that identity is received, it's not earned, that calling arrives before readiness. Every character moves towards wholeness when they stop performing and they start trusting. We can ask, what realm is the story set in? This is a realm of transition. It's this space where faith begins. Everyone is in between. They are in the in between dimensions, between identities, between grief and growth, between failure and starting again. Does the film communicate truth or lies? Friends, it communicates truth. Calling is diverse, it's communal, it's unearned, and it's dignifying. It doesn't flatten your identity, calling honors it. It doesn't demand sameness, it celebrates differences. If we watch attentively and we reflect spiritually, as the credits roll, we can lead from story using Into the Spider-Verse to point to Christ. Now, as I sit with Into the Spider-Verse, I smile at the colors, the humor, the glitching chaos. I am in for the ride. I am ready because it's awesome. But I am also struck by how the movie reveals how quickly we learn to shrink into ourselves. Because I know what it's like to feel the gap between who God says I am and who I quietly decide I'm actually allowed to be. I know what it's like to wait for readiness, to compare our gifts, to hide our differences, to assume calling is for someone else. And as I watch this film, I think about how Miles' internal life is glitching and how that is my glitch. This feeling of being out of sync with who God says that we are. And as I think on these things as the credits are rolling Into the Spider-Verse, it invites me to ask, where am I waiting for confidence instead of trusting grace? Where am I imitating someone else instead of receiving my own calling? Where do I treat difference as a liability instead of a design? And where do I fear the leap more than I trust the one who calls? And I am so thankful that while Into the Spider-Verse leads me to ask these kind of questions, Scripture offers me answers with steady clarity. Because Exodus 3 and 4 shows me that God calls before we feel capable. And Matthew 14 reminds me that Jesus holds us even when we sink. So maybe the invitation today isn't to perfect the mask. Maybe it's to trust the call. To stop rehearsing, maybe it's to trust the call. To stop rehearsing someone else's story, to step into the identity that you already spoken over us. To discover that readiness isn't the requirement, that willingness is. For followers of Jesus, this is not just a nice idea. It is the shape of discipleship that Jesus keeps inviting us into. To come and rest before we feel steady. To follow him before we feel ready. Into the Spider-Verse leaves us with courage, not because Miles is perfect, but because he is willing. And that ache points beyond the film. It reveals how deeply we long for a world where calling is shared, where difference is honored, where identity is received, and where community forms us. So how do we carry that ache, that point into conversation? Well, we let Into the Spider-Verse function as a mirror to us, and we allow it to ask, where am I waiting for readiness instead of trusting grace? We let it become a window into the worldview, and we think, how does our world treat calling as competition? And then we see Into the Spider-Verse as a parable. What happens when calling is received, not earned? And we let the gospel speak, and we say, where is Jesus inviting me to leap before I feel steady, before I feel ready? So just imagine a life where you don't have to audition to belong, where your difference becomes dignity, where your gifts become grace, and where your story becomes a place that God speaks. Imagine a community of believers where calling is not a contest, where gifts are not ranked, where stories are not compared, where formation replaces performance. This is the world that Jesus makes possible, a world where calling does not crush us, because grace is the one holding the weight. Friends, when we let Into the Spider-Verse and the gospel sit at the same table and speak together, we discover that beneath the colors, the chaos, and the glitching dimensions, the film is really asking, What if you don't have to be ready to be called? And the gospel of Jesus Christ responds, calling isn't earned, it's received. Identity isn't proven, it's spoken. Readiness is not the requirement, willingness is. And the one who calls you is the one who will catch you when you leap. Thanks so much for joining me through this episode, friends. Into the Spider-Verse shows us a world where calling feels out of reach. Exodus 3 and 4 show us a world where God calls before we feel capable. And Matthew 14 shows us a world where Jesus holds us even when we sink. And if this episode resonated with you, if you want to learn to live in a world where you don't have to be ready to be called, where your difference becomes design, where your identity is received, it's not performed, then I want to invite you into the Scripture Through Story Challenge. For 5 evenings, I'm going to guide you through a simple, story-shaped way of seeing Scripture, film, in your own life using the same lens that we use today. You'll learn how to recognize the false stories you've been living in, see the story God is telling, and step into calling not with perfection, but with willingness. If you're longing for clarity, for coherence, and a faith that feels whole again, then this is your next step. The next challenge is coming up soon. You can join us through the link in the show notes or by going to cinematicscripture.com/challenge. I'm Kyle. This is Cinematic Scripture. Watch attentively, reflect spiritually, and lead from story. I'll see you next time.